Proteus, according to the poets, was Neptune's herdsman, an old man and a most extraordinary prophet who understood things past and present as well as future, so that besides the business of divination, he was the revealer and interpreter of all antiquity and secrets of every kind. He lived in a vast cave, where his custom was to tell over his herd of sea calves at noon, and then to sleep. Whoever consulted him had no other way of obtaining an answer, but by binding him with manacles and fetters, when he, endeavoring to free himself, would change into all kinds of shapes and miraculous forms, as of fire, water, wild beasts, and sea, till at length he resumed his own shape again. Explanation. This fable seems to point at the secrets of nature and the states of matter. For the person of Proteus denotes matter, the oldest of all things, after God himself, that resides, as in a cave, under the vast concavity of the heavens. He is represented as the servant of Neptune because the various operations and modifications of matter are principally wrought in a fluid state. The herd or flock of Proteus seems to be no other than the several kinds of animals, plants, and minerals in which matter appears to diffuse and spend itself, so that after having formed these several species, and as it were finished its task, it seems to sleep and repose without otherwise attempting to produce any new ones. And this is the moral of Proteus's counting his herd, then going to sleep. This is said to be done at noon, not in the morning or evening, by which is meant the time best fitted and disposed for the production of species, from a matter duly prepared and made ready beforehand, and now lying in a middle state between its first rudiments and decline, which, we learn from sacred history, was the case at the time of the creation, when, by the efficacy of the divine command, matter directly came together, without any transformation or intermediate changes, which it effects, instantly obeyed the order, and appeared in the form of creatures. And thus far the fable reaches of Proteus and his flock, at liberty and unrestrained. For the universe, with the common structures and fabrics of the creatures, is the face of matter, not under constraint, or as the flock wrought upon and tortured by human means. But if any skillful minister of nature shall apply force to matter, and by design torture and vex it, in order to its annihilation, it, on the contrary, being brought under this necessity, changes and transforms itself into a strange variety of shapes and appearances. For nothing but the power of the Creator can annihilate or truly destroy it. So that at length, running through the whole circle of transformations, and completing its period, it in some degree restores itself, if the force be continued. And that method of binding, torturing, or detaining will prove the most effectual and expeditious, which makes use of manacles and fetters, that is, lays hold and works upon matter in the extremest degrees. The addition in the fable that makes Proteus a prophet, who had the knowledge of things past, present, and future, excellently agrees with the nature of matter. As he who knows the properties, the changes, and the processes of matter must, of necessity, understand the effects and sum of what it does, has done, or can do, though his knowledge extends not to all the parts and particulars thereof. Roman 14, Memnon or a youth too forward. Explained of the fatal precipitancy of youth. The poets made Memnon the son of Aurora, and bring him to the Trojan War in beautiful armor, and flushed with popular praise, where, thirsting after further glory and rashly hurrying on to the greatest enterprises, he engages the bravest warrior of all the Greeks, Achilles, and falls by his hand in single combat. Jupiter, in commiseration of his death, sent birds to grace his funeral, that perpetually chanted certain mournful and bewailing dirges. It is also reported that the rays of the rising sun, striking his statue, used to give a lamenting sound. Explanation. This fable regards the unfortunate end of those promising youths who, like sons of the morning, elate with empty hopes and glittering outsides, attempt things beyond their strength, challenge the bravest heroes, provoke them to the combat, and, proving unequal, die in their high attempts. The death of such youths seldom fails to meet with infinite pity, as no mortal calamity is more moving and afflicting than to see the flower of virtue cropped before its time. Nay, the prime of life enjoyed to the full, or even to a degree of envy, does not assuage or moderate the grief occasioned by the untimely death of such hopeful youths, but lamentations and bewailings fly, like mournful birds, about their tombs for a long while after. Especially upon all fresh occasions, new commotions, and the beginning of great actions, the passionate desire of them is renewed, as by the sun's morning rays. Roman 15, Tithonus or satiety. Explained of predominant passions. It is elegantly fabled by Tithonus that being exceedingly beloved by Aurora, she petitioned Jupiter that he might prove immortal, thereby to secure herself the everlasting enjoyment of his company. But through female inadvertence she forgot to add that he might never grow old. So that, though he proved immortal, he became miserably worn and consumed with age, insomuch that Jupiter, out of pity, at length transformed him to a grasshopper. Explanation. This fable seems to contain an ingenious description of pleasure, which at first, as it were in the morning of the day, is so welcome that men pray to have it everlasting, but forget that satiety and weariness of it will, like old age, overtake them, though they think not of it. So that at length, when their appetite for pleasurable actions is gone, their desires and affections often continue. Whence we commonly find that aged persons delight themselves with the discourse and remembrance of the things agreeable to them in their better days. This is very remarkable in men of a loose, and men of a military life, the former whereof are always talking over their amours, and the latter the exploits of their youth, like grasshoppers, that show their vigor only by their chirping. Roman 16, Juno's suitor or baseness. Explained of submission and abjection. The poets tell us that Jupiter, to carry on his love intrigues, assumed many different shapes, as of a bull, an eagle, a swan, a golden shower, and sea. But when he attempted Juno, he turned himself into the most ignoble and ridiculous creature, even that of a wretched, wet, weather-beaten, affrighted, trembling, and half-starved cuckoo. Explanation. This is a wise fable and drawn from the very entrails of morality. The moral is that men should not be conceited of themselves, and imagine that a discovery of their excellences will always render them acceptable. For this can only succeed according to the nature and manners of the person they court or solicit, who, if he be a man not of the same gifts and endowments, but altogether of a haughty and contemptuous behavior, here represented by the person of Juno, they must entirely drop the character that carries the least show of worth or gracefulness. If they proceed upon any other footing, it is downright folly. Nor is it sufficient to act the deformity of obsequiousness, unless they really change themselves and become abject and contemptible in their persons. Roman 17, Cupid or an atom. Explained of the corpuscular philosophy. The particulars related by the poets of Cupid, or love, do not properly agree to the same person, yet they differ only so far that if the confusion of persons be rejected, the correspondence may hold. They say that love was the most ancient of all the gods and existed before everything else except chaos, which is held coeval therewith. But for chaos, the ancients never paid divine honors, nor gave the title of a god thereto. Love is represented absolutely without progenitor, excepting only that he is said to have proceeded from the egg of Nox, but that himself begot the gods and all things else on chaos. His attributes are four, viz. 1. Perpetual infancy, 2. Blindness, 3. Nakedness, and 4. Archery. There was also another Cupid, or Love, the youngest son of the gods, born of Venus, and upon him the attributes of the elder are transferred, with some degree of correspondence. Explanation. This fable points at and enters the cradle of nature. Love seems to be the appetite or incentive of the primitive matter, or, to speak more distinctly, the natural motion or moving principle of the original corpuscles or atoms, this being the most ancient and only power that made and wrought all things out of matter. It is absolutely without parent, that is, without cause, for causes are as parents to effects, but this power or efficacy could have no natural cause, for, excepting God, nothing was before it, and therefore it could have no efficient in nature. And as nothing is more inward with nature, it can neither be a genus nor a form, and therefore, whatever it is, it must be somewhat positive, though inexpressible. And if it were possible to conceive its modus and process, yet it could not be known from its cause, as being, next to God, the cause of causes and itself without a cause. And, perhaps, we are not to hope that the modus of it should fall, or be comprehended, under human inquiry. Whence it is properly feigned to be the egg of Nox, or laid in the dark. The divine philosopher declares that God has made everything beautiful in its season, and has given over the world to our disputes and inquiries. But that man cannot find out the work which God has wrought, from its beginning up to its end. Thus the summary or collective law of nature, or the principle of love, impressed by God upon the original particles of all things, so as to make them attack each other and come together, by the repetition and multiplication whereof all the variety in the universe is produced, can scarce possibly find full admittance into the thoughts of men, though some faint notion may be had thereof. The Greek philosophy is subtile, and busied in discovering the material principles of things, but negligent and languid in discovering the principles of motion, in which the energy and efficacy of every operation consists. And here the Greek philosophers seem perfectly blind and childish, for the opinion of the Peripatetics, as to the stimulus of matter by privation, is little more than words, or rather sound than signification. And they who refer it to God, though they do well therein, yet they do it by a start, and not by proper degrees of assent. For doubtless there is one summary, or capital law, in which nature meets, subordinate to God, viz., the law mentioned in the passage above quoted from Solomon, or the work which God has wrought from its beginning to its end. Democritus, who further considered this subject, having first supposed an atom or corpuscle of some dimension or figure, attributed thereto an appetite, desire, or first motion simply, and another comparatively, imagining that all things properly tended to the center of the world, those containing more matter falling faster to the center, and thereby removing, and in the shock driving away, such as held less. But this is a slender conceit, and regards too few particulars, for neither the revolutions of the celestial bodies, nor the contractions and expansions of things, can be reduced to this principle. And for the opinion of Epicurus, as to the declination and fortuitous agitation of atoms, this only brings the matter back again to a trifle, and wraps it up in ignorance and night. Cupid is elegantly drawn a perpetual child, for compounds are larger things and have their periods of age, but the first seeds or atoms of bodies are small and remain in a perpetual infant state. He is again justly represented naked, as all compounds may properly be said to be dressed and clothed or to assume a personage, whence nothing remains truly naked but the original particles of things. The blindness of Cupid contains a deep allegory, for this same Cupid, love, or appetite of the world, seems to have very little foresight, but directs his steps and motions conformably to what he finds next him, as blind men do when they feel out their way, which renders the divine and overruling providence and foresight the more surprising. As by a certain steady law, it brings such a beautiful order and regularity of things out of what seems extremely casual, void of design, and, as it were, really blind. The last attribute of Cupid is archery, viz., a virtue or power operating at a distance, for everything that operates at a distance may seem, as it were, to dart or shoot with arrows. And whoever allows of atoms and vacuity necessarily supposes that the virtue of atoms operates at a distance. For without this operation, no motion could be excited, on account of the vacuum interposing, but all things would remain sluggish and unmoved. As to the other Cupid, he is properly said to be the youngest son of the gods, as his power could not take place before the formation of species or particular bodies. The description given us of him transfers the allegory to morality, though he still retains some resemblance with the ancient Cupid. For as Venus universally excites the affection of association and the desire of procreation, her son Cupid applies the affection to individuals, so that the general disposition proceeds from Venus, but the more close sympathy from Cupid. The former depends upon a near approximation of causes, but the latter upon deeper, more necessitating and uncontrollable principles, as if they proceeded from the ancient Cupid, on whom all exquisite sympathies depend. Roman 18, Diomd or zeal. Explained of persecution, or zeal for religion. Diomd acquired great glory and honor at the Trojan War, and was highly favored by Pallas, who encouraged and excited him by no means to spare Venus, if he should casually meet her in fight. He followed the advice with too much eagerness and intrepidity, and accordingly wounded that goddess in her hand. This presumptuous action remained unpunished for a time, and when the war was ended, he returned with great glory and renown to his own country, where, finding himself embroiled with domestic affairs, he retired into Italy. Here also, at first, he was well received and nobly entertained by King Daunus, who, besides other gifts and honors, erected statues for him over all his dominions. But upon the first calamity that afflicted the people after the stranger's arrival, Daunus immediately reflected that he entertained a devoted person in his palace, an enemy to the gods, and one who had sacrilegiously wounded a goddess with his sword, whom it was impious but to touch. To expiate, therefore, his country's guilt, he, without regard to the laws of hospitality, which were less regarded by him than the laws of religion, directly slew his guest, and commanded his statues and all his honors to be razed and abolished. Nor was it safe for others to commiserate or bewail so cruel a destiny, but even his companions in arms, whilst they lamented the death of their leader, and filled all places with their complaints, were turned into a kind of swans, which are said, at the approach of their own death, to chant sweet melancholy dirges. Explanation. This fable intimates an extraordinary and almost singular thing, for no hero besides Diomed is recorded to have wounded any of the gods. Doubtless, we have here described the nature and fate of a man who professedly makes any divine worship or sect of religion, though, in itself vain and light, the only scope of his actions, and resolves to propagate it by fire and sword. For although the bloody dissensions and differences about religion were unknown to the ancients, yet so copious and diffusive was their knowledge, that what they knew not by experience they comprehended in thought and representation. Those, therefore, who endeavor to reform or establish any sect of religion, though vain, corrupt, and infamous, which is here denoted under the person of Venus, not by the force of reason, learning, sanctity of manners, the weight of arguments and examples, but would spread or extirpate it by persecution, pains, penalties, tortures, fire, and sword may, perhaps, be instigated hereto by Pallas, that is, by a certain rigid, prudential consideration and a severity of judgment. By the vigor and efficacy whereof they see thoroughly into the fallacies and fictions of the delusions of this kind, and through aversion to depravity and a well-meant zeal, these men usually for a time acquire great fame and glory, and are by the vulgar, to whom no moderate measures can be acceptable, extolled and almost adored. As the only patrons and protectors of truth and religion, men of any other disposition seeming, in comparison with these, to be lukewarm, mean-spirited, and cowardly. This fame and felicity, however, seldom endures to the end, but all violence, unless it escapes the reverses and changes of things by untimely death, is commonly unprosperous in the issue. And if a change of affairs happens, and that sect of religion which was persecuted and oppressed gains strength and rises again, then the zeal and warm endeavors of this sort of men are condemned, their very name becomes odious, and all their honors terminate in disgrace. As to the point that Diomed should be slain by his hospitable entertainer, this denotes that religious dissensions may cause treachery, bloody animosities, and deceit, even between the nearest friends. That complaining or bewailing should not, in so enormous a case, be permitted to friends affected by the catastrophe without punishment, includes this prudent admonition, that almost in all kinds of wickedness and depravity men have still room left for commiseration, so that they who hate the crime may yet pity the person and bewail his calamity, from a principle of humanity and good nature. And to forbid the overflowings and intercourses of pity upon such occasions were the extremest of evils. Yet in the cause of religion and impiety the very commiserations of men are noted and suspected. On the other hand, the lamentations and complainings of the followers and attendants of Diomed, that is, of men of the same sect or persuasion, are usually very sweet, agreeable, and moving, like the dying notes of swans or the birds of Diomed. This also is a noble and remarkable part of the allegory, denoting that the last words of those who suffer for the sake of religion strongly affect and sway men's minds, and leave a lasting impression upon the sense and memory. Roman 19, Daedalus or mechanical skill. Explained of arts and artists in kingdoms and states. The ancients have left us a description of mechanical skill, industry, and curious arts converted to ill uses in the person of Daedalus, a most ingenious but execrable artist. This Daedalus was banished for the murder of his brother artist and rival, yet found a kind reception in his banishment from the kings and states where he came. He raised many incomparable edifices to the honor of the gods, and invented many new contrivances for the beautifying and ennobling of cities and public places. But still, he was most famous for wicked inventions. Among the rest, by his abominable industry and destructive genius, he assisted in the fatal and infamous production of the monster Minotaur, that devourer of promising youths. And then, to cover one mischief with another and provide for the security of this monster, he invented and built a labyrinth, a work infamous for its end and design, but admirable and prodigious for art and workmanship. After this, that he might not only be celebrated for wicked inventions, but be sought after, as well for prevention as for instruments of mischief, he formed that ingenious device of his clue, which led directly through all the windings of the labyrinth. This Daedalus was persecuted by Minos with the utmost severity, diligence, and inquiry, but he always found refuge and means of escaping. Lastly, endeavoring to teach his son Icarus the art of flying, the novice, trusting too much to his wings, fell from his towering flight and was drowned in the sea. Explanation. The sense of the fable runs thus. It first denotes envy, which is continually upon the watch and strangely prevails among excellent artificers, for no kind of people are observed to be more implacably and destructively envious to one another than these. In the next place, it observes an impolitic and improvident kind of punishment inflicted upon Daedalus, that of banishment. For good workmen are gladly received everywhere, so that banishment to an excellent artificer is scarce any punishment at all, whereas other conditions of life cannot easily flourish from home. For the admiration of artists is propagated and increased among foreigners and strangers, it being a principle in the minds of men to slight and despise the mechanical operators of their own nation. The succeeding part of the fable is plain, concerning the use of mechanic arts, whereto human life stands greatly indebted, as receiving from this treasury numerous particulars for the service of religion, the ornament of civil society, and the whole provision and apparatus of life. But then the same magazine supplies instruments of lust, cruelty, and death. For not to mention the arts of luxury and debauchery, we plainly see how far the business of exquisite poisons, guns, engines of war, and such kind of destructive inventions exceeds the cruelty and barbarity of the Minotaur himself. The edition of the Labyrinth contains a beautiful allegory representing the nature of mechanic arts in general. For all ingenious and accurate mechanical inventions may be conceived as a labyrinth, which, by reason of their subtlety, intricacy, crossing, and interfering with one another, and the apparent resemblances they have among themselves, scarce any power of the judgment can unravel and distinguish, so that they are only to be understood and traced by the clue of experience. It is no less prudently added that he who invented the windings of the labyrinth should also show the use and management of the clue. For mechanical arts have an ambiguous or double use and serve as well to produce as to prevent mischief and destruction, so that their virtue almost destroys or unwinds itself. Unlawful arts, and indeed frequently arts themselves, are persecuted by Minos, that is, by laws which prohibit and forbid their use among the people. But notwithstanding this, they are hid, concealed, retained, and everywhere find reception and skulking places, a thing well observed by Tacitus of the astrologers and fortune-tellers of his time. These, says he, are a kind of men that will always be prohibited, and yet will always be retained in our city. But lastly, all unlawful and vain arts, of what kind soever, lose their reputation in tract of time, grow contemptible and perish, through their overconfidence, like Icarus, being commonly unable to perform what they boasted. And to say the truth, such arts are better suppressed by their own vain pretensions than checked or restrained by the bridle of laws. Roman 20, Erichthonius or imposture. Explained of the improper use of force in natural philosophy. The poets feign that Vulcan attempted the chastity of Minerva, and impatient of refusal, had recourse to force, the consequence of which was the birth of Erichthonius, whose body from the middle upwards was comely and well proportioned, but his thighs and legs small, shrunk, and deformed like an eel. Conscious of this defect, he became the inventor of chariots, so as to show the graceful, but conceal the deformed part of his body. Explanation. This strange fable seems to carry this meaning. Art is here represented under the person of Vulcan by reason of the various uses it makes of fire, and nature under the person of Minerva by reason of the industry employed in her works. Art, therefore, whenever it offers violence to nature, in order to conquer, subdue, and bend her to its purpose, by tortures and force of all kinds, seldom obtains the end proposed. Yet upon great struggle and application, there proceed certain imperfect births or lame abortive works, specious in appearance but weak and unstable in use, which are, nevertheless, with great pomp and deceitful appearances, triumphantly carried about, and shown by impostors. A procedure very familiar and remarkable in chemical productions and new mechanical inventions, especially when the inventors rather hug their errors than improve upon them, and go on struggling with nature, not courting her. Roman 21, Deucalion or restitution. Explained of a useful hint in natural philosophy. The poets tell us that the inhabitants of the old world being totally destroyed by the universal deluge, excepting Deucalion and Pyrrha, these two, desiring with zealous and fervent devotion to restore mankind, received this oracle for answer, that they should succeed by throwing their mother's bones behind them. This at first cast them into great sorrow and despair, because, as all things were leveled by the deluge, it was in vain to seek their mother's tomb. But at length they understood the expression of the oracle to signify the stones of the earth, which is esteemed the mother of all things. Explanation. This fable seems to reveal a secret of nature and correct an error familiar to the mind. For men's ignorance leads them to expect the renovation or restoration of things from their corruption and remains, as the phoenix is said to be restored out of its ashes, which is a very improper procedure, because such kind of materials have finished their course and are become absolutely unfit to supply the first rudiments of the same things again. Whence, in cases of renovation, recourse should be had to more common principles. Roman 22, Nemesis or the vicissitude of things. Explained of the reverses of fortune. Nemesis is represented as a goddess venerated by all, but feared by the powerful and the fortunate. She is said to be the daughter of Nox and Oceanus. She is drawn with wings and a crown, a javelin of ash in her right hand, a glass containing Ethiopians in her left, and riding upon a stag. Explanation. The fable receives this explanation. The word nemesis manifestly signifies revenge or retribution, for the office of this goddess consisted in interposing, like the Roman tribunes, with an eye forbid it, in all courses of constant and perpetual felicity, so as not only to chastise haughtiness, but also to repay even innocent and moderate happiness with adversity, as if it were decreed that none of human race should be admitted to the banquet of the gods, but for sport. And indeed, to read over that chapter of Pliny, wherein he has collected the miseries and misfortunes of Augustus Caesar, whom, of all mankind, one would judge most fortunate, as he had a certain art of using and enjoying prosperity, with a mind no way tumid, light, effeminate, confused, or melancholic. One cannot but think this a very great and powerful goddess, who could bring such a victim to her altar. The parents of this goddess were Oceanus and Nox, that is, the fluctuating change of things, and the obscure and secret divine decrees. The changes of things are aptly represented by the ocean, on account of its perpetual ebbing and flowing, and secret providence is justly expressed by night. Even the heathens have observed this secret nemesis of the night, or the difference betwixt divine and human judgment. Wings are given to Nemesis because of the sudden and unforeseen changes of things, for, from the earliest account of time, it has been common for great and prudent men to fall by the dangers they most despised. Thus Cicero, when admonished by Brutus of the infidelity and rancor of Octavius, coolly wrote back, "I cannot, however, but be obliged to you, Brutus, as I ought for informing me, though of such a trifle." Nemesis also has her crown, by reason of the invidious and malignant nature of the vulgar, who generally rejoice, triumph, and crown her at the fall of the fortunate and the powerful. And for the javelin in her right hand, it has regard to those whom she has actually struck and transfixed. But whoever escapes her stroke, or feels not actual calamity or misfortune, she affrights with a black and dismal sight in her left hand. For doubtless, mortals on the highest pinnacle of felicity have a prospect of death, diseases, calamities, perfidious friends, undermining enemies, reverses of fortune, and sea, represented by the Ethiopians in her glass. Thus Virgil, with great elegance, describing the battle of Actium, says of Cleopatra, that she did not yet perceive the two asps behind her. But soon after, which way soever she turned, she saw whole troops of Ethiopians still before her. Lastly, it is significantly added that Nemesis rides upon a stag, which is a very long-lived creature. For though perhaps some, by an untimely death in youth, may prevent or escape this goddess, yet they who enjoy a long flow of happiness and power doubtless become subject to her at length and are brought to yield. Roman 23, Aclis or battle. Explained of war by invasion. The ancients relate that Hercules and Aclis being rivals in the courtship of Deianira, the matter was contested by single combat, when Aclis, having transformed himself, as he had power to do, into various shapes by way of trial, at length, in the form of a fierce wild bull, prepares himself for the fight. But Hercules still retains his human shape, engages sharply with him, and in the issue broke off one of the bull's horns. And now Aclis, in great pain and fright, to redeem his horn, presents Hercules with the cornucopia. Explanation. This fable relates to military expeditions and preparations, for the preparation of war on the defensive side, here denoted by Aclis, appears in various shapes, whilst the invading side has but one simple form, consisting either in an army or perhaps a fleet. But the country that expects the invasion is employed infinite ways, in fortifying towns, blockading passes, rivers, and ports, raising soldiers, disposing garrisons, building and breaking down bridges, procuring aids, securing provisions, arms, ammunition, and sea, so that there appears a new face of things every day. And at length, when the country is sufficiently fortified and prepared, it represents to the life the form and threats of a fierce fighting bull. On the other side, the invader presses on to the fight, fearing to be distressed in an enemy's country. And if after the battle he remains master of the field and has now broke, as it were, the horn of his enemy, the besieged, of course, retire inglorious, affrighted, and dismayed to their stronghold, there endeavoring to secure themselves, and repair their strength, leaving, at the same time, their country a prey to the conqueror, which is well expressed by the Amalthean horn or cornucopia. Roman 24, Dionysus or Bacchus. Explained of the passions. The fable runs that Semele, Jupiter's mistress, having bound him by an inviolable oath to grant her an unknown request, desired he would embrace her in the same form and manner he used to embrace Juno. And the promise being irrevocable, she was burnt to death with lightning in the performance. The embryo, however, was sewed up and carried in Jupiter's thigh till the complete time of its birth. But the burden thus rendering the father lame and causing him pain, the child was thence called Dionysus. When born, he was committed for some years to be nursed by Proserpina, and when grown up appeared with so effeminate a face that his sex seemed somewhat doubtful. He also died and was buried for a time, but afterwards revived. When a youth, he first introduced the cultivation and dressing of vines, the method of preparing wine, and taught the use thereof, whence becoming famous, he subdued the world, even to the utmost bounds of the Indies. He rode in a chariot drawn by tigers. There danced about him certain deformed demons called Cobali, and see the Muses also joined in his train. He married Ariadne, who was deserted by Theseus. The ivy was sacred to him. He was also held the inventor and institutor of religious rites and ceremonies, but such as were wild, frantic, and full of corruption and cruelty. He had also the power of striking men with frenzies. Pentheus and Orpheus were torn to pieces by the frantic women at his orgies, the first for climbing a tree to behold their outrageous ceremonies, and the other for the music of his harp. But the acts of this god are much entangled and confounded with those of Jupiter. Explanation. This fable seems to contain a little system of morality, so that there is scarce any better invention in all ethics. Under the history of Bacchus is drawn the nature of unlawful desire or affection, and disorder. For the appetite and thirst of apparent good is the mother of all unlawful desire, though ever so destructive, and all unlawful desires are conceived in unlawful wishes or requests, rashly indulged or granted before they are well understood or considered. And when the affection begins to grow warm, the mother of it, the nature of good, is destroyed and burnt up by the heat. And whilst an unlawful desire lies in the embryo, or unripened in the mind, which is its father, and here represented by Jupiter, it is cherished and concealed, especially in the inferior part of the mind, corresponding to the thigh of the body, where pain twitches and depresses the mind so far as to render its resolutions and actions imperfect and lame. And even after this child of the mind is confirmed and gains strength by consent and habit and comes forth into action, it must still be nursed by Proserpina for a time. That is, it skulks and hides its head in a clandestine manner, as it were underground, till at length, when the checks of shame and fear are removed, and the requisite boldness acquired, it either assumes the pretext of some virtue or openly despises infamy. And it is justly observed that every vehement passion appears of a doubtful sex, as having the strength of a man at first, but at last the impotence of a woman. It is also excellently added that Bacchus died and rose again, for the affections sometimes seem to die and be no more, but there is no trusting them, even though they were buried, being always apt and ready to rise again whenever the occasion or object offers. That Bacchus should be the inventor of wine carries a fine allegory with it, for every affection is cunning and subtle in discovering a proper matter to nourish and feed it. And of all things known to mortals, wine is the most powerful and effectual for exciting and inflaming passions of all kinds, being, indeed, like a common fuel to all. It is again, with great elegance, observed of Bacchus, that he subdued provinces and undertook endless expeditions, for the affections never rest satisfied with what they enjoy, but with an endless and insatiable appetite thirst after something further. And tigers are prettily fain to draw the chariot, for as soon as any affection shall, from going on foot, be advanced to ride, it triumphs over reason, and exerts its cruelty, fierceness, and strength against all that oppose it. It is also humorously imagined that ridiculous demons dance and frisk about this chariot. For every passion produces indecent, disorderly, interchangeable, and deformed motions in the eyes, countenance, and gesture, so that the person under the impulse, whether of anger, insult, love, and though to himself he may seem grand, lofty, or obliging, yet in the eyes of others appears mean, contemptible, or ridiculous. The Muses also are found in the train of Bacchus, for there is scarce any passion without its art, science, or doctrine to court and flatter it. But in this respect, the indulgence of men of genius has greatly detracted from the majesty of the Muses, who ought to be the leaders and conductors of human life, and not the handmaids of the passions. The allegory of Bacchus falling in love with a caste mistress is extremely noble, for it is certain that the affections always court and covet what has been rejected upon experience. And all those who by serving and indulging their passions immensely raise the value of enjoyment should know that whatever they covet and pursue, whether riches, pleasure, glory, learning, or anything else, they only pursue those things that have been forsaken and cast off with contempt by great numbers in all ages, after possession and experience. Nor is it without a mystery that the ivy was sacred to Bacchus, and this for two reasons. First, because ivy is an evergreen or flourishes in the winter, and secondly, because it winds and creeps about so many things as trees, walls, and buildings, and raises itself above them. As to the first, every passion grows fresh, strong, and vigorous by opposition and prohibition, as it were by a kind of contrast or antiperistases, like the ivy in the winter. And for the second, the predominant passion of the mind throws itself, like the ivy, round all human actions, entwines all our resolutions, and perpetually adheres to, and mixes itself among, or even overtops them. And no wonder that superstitious rites and ceremonies are attributed to Bacchus, when almost every ungovernable passion grows wanton and luxuriant in corrupt religions. Nor again, that fury and frenzy should be sent and dealt out by him, because every passion is a short frenzy, and if it be vehement, lasting, and take deep root, it terminates in madness. And hence the allegory of Pentheus and Orpheus being torn to pieces is evident, for every headstrong passion is extremely bitter, severe, inveterate, and revengeful upon all curious inquiry, wholesome admonition, free counsel, and persuasion. Lastly, the confusion between the persons of Jupiter and Bacchus will justly admit of an allegory, because noble and meritorious actions may sometimes proceed from virtue, sound reason, and magnanimity, and sometimes again from a concealed passion and secret desire of ill, however they may be extolled and praised, insomuch that it is not easy to distinguish betwixt the acts of Bacchus and the acts of Jupiter. Roman 25, Atalanta and Hippomenes or Gain. Explained of the contest betwixt art and nature. Atalanta, who was exceedingly fleet, contended with Hippomenes in the course, on condition that, if Hippomenes won, he should espouse her, or forfeit his life if he lost. The match was very unequal, for Atalanta had conquered numbers to their destruction. Hippomenes, therefore, had recourse to stratagem. He procured 3 golden apples and purposely carried them with him. They started. Atalanta outstripped him soon. Then Hippomenes bowled one of his apples before her, across the course, in order not only to make her stoop, but to draw her out of the path. She, prompted by female curiosity and the beauty of the golden fruit, starts from the course to take up the apple. Hippomenes, in the meantime, holds on his way and steps before her. But she, by her natural swiftness, soon fetches up her lost ground and leaves him again behind. Hippomenes, however, by rightly timing his second and third throw, at length won the race, not by his swiftness, but his cunning. Explanation. This fable seems to contain a noble allegory of the contest betwixt art and nature. For art, here denoted by Atalanta, is much swifter or more expeditious in its operations than nature, when all obstacles and impediments are removed, and sooner arrives at its end. This appears almost in every instance. Thus, fruit comes slowly from the kernel, but soon by inoculation or incision. Clay, left to itself, is a long time in acquiring a stony hardness, but is presently burnt by fire into brick. So again, in human life, nature is a long while in alleviating and abolishing the remembrance of pain, and assuaging the troubles of the mind, but moral philosophy, which is the art of living, performs it presently. Yet this prerogative and singular efficacy of art is stopped and retarded to the infinite detriment of human life, by certain golden apples. For there is no one science or art that constantly holds on its true and proper course to the end, but they are all continually stopping short, forsaking the track, and turning aside to profit and convenience, exactly like Atalanta. Whence it is no wonder that art gets not the victory over nature, nor, according to the condition of the contest, brings her under subjection, but on the contrary, remains subject to her, as a wife to a husband. Roman 26, Prometheus or the state of man. Explained of an overruling providence and of human nature. The ancients relate that man was the work of Prometheus and formed of clay, only the artificer mixed in with the mass, particles taken from different animals. And being desirous to improve his workmanship, and endow, as well as create, the human race, he stole up to heaven with a bundle of birch rods, and kindling them at the chariot of the sun, thence brought down fire to the earth for the service of men. They add that, for this meritorious act, Prometheus was repaid with ingratitude by mankind, so that, forming a conspiracy, they arraigned both him and his invention before Jupiter. But the matter was otherwise received than they imagined, for the accusation proved extremely grateful to Jupiter, and the gods, insomuch that, delighted with the action, they not only indulged mankind the use of fire, but moreover conferred upon them a most acceptable and desirable present, viz., perpetual youth. But men, foolishly overjoyed hereat, laid this present of the gods upon an ass, who, in returning back with it, being extremely thirsty, strayed to a fountain. The serpent, who was guardian thereof, would not suffer him to drink, but upon condition of receiving the burden he carried, whatever it should be. The silly ass complied, and thus the perpetual renewal of youth was, for a drop of water, transferred from men to the race of serpents. Prometheus, not desisting from his unwarrantable practices, though now reconciled to mankind, after they were thus tricked of their present, but still continuing inveterate against Jupiter, had the boldness to attempt deceit, even in a sacrifice, and is said to have once offered up 2 bulls to Jupiter, but so as in the hide of one of them to wrap all the flesh and fat of both, and stuffing out the other hide only with the bones. Then, in a religious and devout manner, gave Jupiter his choice of the 2. Jupiter, detesting this sly fraud and hypocrisy, but having thus an opportunity of punishing the offender, purposely chose the mock bull. And now giving way to revenge, but finding he could not chastise the insolence of Prometheus without afflicting the human race, in the production whereof Prometheus had strangely and insufferably prided himself, he commanded Vulcan to form a beautiful and graceful woman to whom every god presented a certain gift, whence she was called Pandora. They put into her hands an elegant box, containing all sorts of miseries and misfortunes, but hope was placed at the bottom of it. With this box she first goes to Prometheus, to try if she could prevail upon him to receive and open it, but he, being upon his guard, warily refused the offer. Upon this refusal, she comes to his brother Epimetheus, a man of a very different temper, who rashly and inconsiderately opens the box. When finding all kinds of miseries and misfortunes issued out of it, he grew wise too late, and with great hurry and struggle endeavored to clap the cover on again. But with all his endeavor could scarce keep in hope, which lay at the bottom. Lastly, Jupiter arraigned Prometheus of many heinous crimes, as that he formerly stole fire from heaven, that he contemptuously and deceitfully mocked him by a sacrifice of bones, that he despised his present, adding withal a new crime, that he attempted to ravish Pallas, for all which he was sentenced to be bound in chains and doomed to perpetual torments. Accordingly, by Jupiter's command, he was brought to Mount Caucasus, and there fastened to a pillar, so firmly that he could no way stir. A vulture or eagle stood by him, which in the daytime gnawed and consumed his liver, but in the night the wasted parts were supplied again, whence matter for his pain was never wanting. They relate, however, that his punishment had an end. For Hercules, sailing the ocean in a cup or pitcher, presented him by the sun, came at length to Caucasus, shot the eagle with his arrows, and set Prometheus free. In certain nations, also, there were instituted particular games of the torch, to the honor of Prometheus, in which they who ran for the prize carried lighted torches. And as any one of these torches happened to go out, the bearer withdrew himself and gave way to the next, and that person was allowed to win the prize, who first brought in his lighted torch to the goal. Explanation. This fable contains and enforces many just and serious considerations, some whereof have been long since well observed, but some again remain perfectly untouched. Prometheus clearly and expressly signifies providence, for of all the things in nature, the formation and endowment of man was singled out by the ancients and esteemed the peculiar work of providence. The reason hereof seems, 1, that the nature of man includes a mind and understanding, which is the seat of providence. 2, that it is harsh and incredible to suppose reason and mind should be raised and drawn out of senseless and irrational principles, whence it becomes almost inevitable that providence is implanted in the human mind in conformity with and by the direction and the design of the greater overruling providence. But 3, the principal cause is this: that man seems to be the thing in which the whole world centers with respect to final causes, so that if he were away, all other things would stray and fluctuate without end or intention, or become perfectly disjointed and out of frame, for all things are made subservient to man, and he receives use and benefit from them all. Thus the revolutions, places, and periods of the celestial bodies serve him for distinguishing times and seasons, and for dividing the world into different regions. The meteors afford him prognostications of the weather. The winds sail our ships, drive our mills, and move our machines. And the vegetables and animals of all kinds either afford us matter for houses and habitations, clothing, food, physic, or tend to ease or delight, to support, or refresh us so that everything in nature seems not made for itself, but for man. And it is not without reason added, that the mass of matter whereof man was formed should be mixed up with particles taken from different animals and wrought in with the clay, because it is certain that of all things in the universe, man is the most compounded and recompounded body, so that the ancients not improperly styled him a microcosm or little world within himself. For although the chemists have absurdly, and too literally, wrested and perverted the elegance of the term microcosm, whilst they pretend to find all kind of mineral and vegetable matters, or something corresponding to them, in man, yet it remains firm and unshaken that the human body is, of all substances, the most mixed and organical, whence it has surprising powers and faculties, for the powers of simple bodies are but few, though certain and quick, as being little broken or weakened and not counterbalanced by mixture. But excellence and quantity of energy reside in mixture and composition. Man, however, in his first origin, seems to be a defenseless, naked creature, slow in assisting himself, and standing in need of numerous things. Prometheus, therefore, hastened to the invention of fire, which supplies and administers to nearly all human uses and necessities, insomuch that, if the soul may be called the form of forms, if the hand may be called the instrument of instruments, fire may, as properly, be called the assistant of assistants, or the helper of helps. For hence proceed numberless operations, hence all the mechanic arts, and hence infinite assistances are afforded to the sciences themselves. The manner wherein Prometheus stole this fire is properly described from the nature of the thing, he being said to have done it by applying a rod of birch to the chariot of the sun. For birch is used in striking and beating, which clearly denotes the generation of fire to be from the violent percussions and collisions of bodies, whereby the matters struck are subtilized, rarefied, put into motion, and so prepared to receive the heat of the celestial bodies. Whence they, in a clandestine and secret manner, collect and snatch fire, as it were by stealth, from the chariot of the sun. The next is a remarkable part of the fable, which represents that men, instead of gratitude and thanks, fell into indignation and expostulation, accusing both Prometheus and his fire to Jupiter. And yet the accusation proved highly pleasing to Jupiter, so that he, for this reason, crowned these benefits of mankind with a new bounty. Here it may seem strange that the sin of ingratitude to a creator and benefactor, a sin so heinous as to include almost all others, should meet with approbation and reward. But the allegory has another view, and denotes that the accusation and arraignment, both of human nature and human art among mankind, proceeds from a most noble and laudable temper of the mind, and tends to a very good purpose, whereas the contrary temper is odious to the gods and unbeneficial in itself. For they who break into extravagant praises of human nature and the arts in vogue, and who lay themselves out in admiring the things they already possess, and will needs have the sciences cultivated among them, to be thought absolutely perfect and complete, in the first place, show little regard to the divine nature, whilst they extol their own inventions almost as high as his perfection. In the next place, men of this temper are unserviceable and prejudicial in life, whilst they imagine themselves already got to the top of things, and their rest without further inquiry. On the contrary, they who arraign and accuse both nature and art, and are always full of complaints against them, not only preserve a more just and modest sense of mind, but are also perpetually stirred up to fresh industry and new discoveries. Is not, then, the ignorance and fatality of mankind to be extremely pitied, whilst they remain slaves to the arrogance of a few of their own fellows, and are dotingly fond of that scrap of Grecian knowledge, the peripatetic philosophy, and this to such a degree as not only to think all accusation or arraignment thereof useless, but even hold it suspect and dangerous. Certainly the procedure of Empedocles, though furious, but especially that of Democritus, who with great modesty complained that all things were abstruse, that we know nothing, that truth lies hid in deep pits, that falsehood is strangely joined and twisted along with truth, and is to be preferred before the confident, assuming, and dogmatical school of Aristotle. Mankind are, therefore, to be admonished that the arraignment of nature and of art is pleasing to the gods, and that a sharp and vehement accusation of Prometheus, though a creator, a founder, and a master, obtained new blessings and presents from the divine bounty, and proved more sound and serviceable than a diffusive harangue of praise and gratulation. And let men be assured that the fond opinion that they have already acquired enough is a principal reason why they have acquired so little. That the perpetual flower of youth should be the present which mankind received as a reward for their accusation, carries this moral: that the ancients seem not to have despaired of discovering methods and remedies for retarding old age and prolonging the period of human life, but rather reckoned it among those things which, through sloth and want of diligent inquiry, perish and come to nothing, after having been once undertaken, than among such as are absolutely impossible, or placed beyond the reach of the human power. For they signify and intimate from the true use of fire, and the just and strenuous accusation and conviction of the errors of art, that the divine bounty is not wanting to men in such kind of presence, but that men indeed are wanting to themselves, and lay such an inestimable gift upon the back of a slow-paced ass. That is, upon the back of the heavy, dull, lingering thing, experience, from whose sluggish and tortoise pace proceeds that ancient complaint of the shortness of life, and the slow advancement of arts. And certainly it may well seem that the two faculties of reasoning and experience are not hitherto properly joined and coupled together, but to be still new gifts of the gods, separately laid, the one upon the back of a light bird or abstract philosophy, and the other upon an ass or slow-paced practice and trial. And yet good hopes might be conceived of this ass, if it were not for his thirst and the accidents of the way. For we judge that if anyone would constantly proceed, by a certain law and method, in the road of experience, and not by the way thirst after such experiments as make for profit or ostentation, nor exchange his burden, or quit the original design for the sake of these, he might be an useful bearer of a new and accumulated divine bounty to mankind. That this gift of perpetual youth should pass from men to serpents seems added by way of ornament and illustration to the fable, perhaps intimating, at the same time, the shame it is for men, that they, with their fire and numerous arts, cannot procure to themselves those things which nature has bestowed upon many other creatures. The sudden reconciliation of Prometheus to mankind, after being disappointed of their hopes, contains a prudent and useful admonition. It points out the levity and temerity of men in new experiments. When, not presently succeeding, or answering to expectation, they precipitately quit their new undertakings, hurry back to their old ones, and grow reconciled thereto. After the fable has described the state of man, with regard to arts and intellectual matters, it passes on to religion. For after the inventing and settling of arts follows the establishment of divine worship, which hypocrisy presently enters into and corrupts. So that by the two sacrifices we have elegantly painted the person of a man truly religious and of an hypocrite. One of these sacrifices contained the fat, or the portion of God, used for burning and incensing, thereby denoting affection and zeal offered up to his glory. It likewise contained the bowels, which are expressive of charity, along with the good and useful flesh. But the other contained nothing more than dry bones, which nevertheless stuffed out the hide, so as to make it resemble a fair, beautiful, and magnificent sacrifice, hereby finally denoting the external and empty rites and barren ceremonies, wherewith men burden and stuff out the divine worship, things rather intended for show and ostentation than conducing to piety. Nor are mankind simply content with this mock worship of God, but also impose and further it upon him, as if he had chosen and ordained it. Certainly the prophet, in the person of God, has a fine expostulation as to this matter of choice. Is this the fasting which I have chosen, that a man should afflict his soul for a day, and bow down his head like a bulrush? After thus touching the state of religion, the fable next turns to manners and the conditions of human life. And though it be a very common, yet is it a just interpretation, that Pandora denotes the pleasures and licentiousness which the cultivation and luxury of the arts of civil life introduce, as it were, by the instrumental efficacy of fire. Whence the works of the voluptuary arts are properly attributed to Vulcan, the god of fire. And hence infinite miseries and calamities have proceeded to the minds, the bodies, and the fortunes of men, together with a late repentance. And this not in each man's particular, but also in kingdoms and states. For wars and tumults and tyrannies have all arisen from the same fountain or box of Pandora. It is worth observing how beautifully and elegantly the fable has drawn two reigning characters in human life, and given two examples or tablatures of them, under the persons of Prometheus and Epimetheus. The followers of Epimetheus are improvident, see not far before them, and prefer such things as are agreeable for the present, whence they are oppressed with numerous straits, difficulties, and calamities, with which they almost continually struggle. But in the meantime gratify their own temper, and, for want of a better knowledge of things, feed their minds with many vain hopes, and as with so many pleasing dreams, delight themselves and sweet the miseries of life. But the followers of Prometheus are the prudent, wary men that look into futurity, and cautiously guard against, prevent, and undermine many calamities and misfortunes. But this watchful, provident temper is attended with a deprivation of numerous pleasures, and the loss of various delights, whilst such men debar themselves the use even of innocent things, and what is still worse, rack and torture themselves with cares, fears, and disquiets. Being bound fast to the pillar of necessity, and tormented with numberless thoughts, which for their swiftness are well compared to an eagle, that continually wound, tear, and gnaw their liver or mind, unless, perhaps, they find some small remission by intervals, or as it were at nights. But then new anxieties, dreads, and fears soon return again, as it were in the morning. And therefore, very few men of either temper have secured to themselves the advantages of providence, and kept clear of disquiets, troubles, and misfortunes. nor indeed can any man obtain this end without the assistance of Hercules. That is, of such fortitude and constancy of mind as stands prepared against every event, and remains indifferent to every change, looking forward without being daunted, enjoying the good without disdain, and enduring the bad without impatience. And it must be observed that even Prometheus had not the power to free himself, but owed his deliverance to another, for no natural inbred force and fortitude could prove equal to such a task. The power of releasing him came from the utmost confines of the ocean, and from the sun, that is, from Apollo or knowledge, and again, from a due consideration of the uncertainty, instability, and fluctuating state of human life, which is aptly represented by sailing the ocean. Accordingly, Virgil has prudently joined these two together, accounting him happy who knows the causes of things, and has conquered all his fears, apprehensions, and superstitions. It is added, with great elegance, for supporting and confirming the human mind, that the great hero who thus delivered him sailed the ocean in a cup or pitcher to prevent fear or complaint. As if, through the narrowness of our nature, or a too great fragility thereof, we were absolutely incapable of that fortitude and constancy to which Seneca finely alludes when he says, "It is a noble thing, at once to participate in the frailty of man and the security of a god." We have hitherto, that we might not break the connection of things, designedly omitted the last crime of Prometheus, that of attempting the chastity of Minerva, which heinous offense it doubtless was, that caused the punishment of having his liver gnawed by the vulture. The meaning seems to be this, that when men are puffed up with arts and knowledge, they often try to subdue even the divine wisdom and bring it under the dominion of sense and reason, whence inevitably follows a perpetual and restless rending and tearing of the mind. A sober and humble distinction must, therefore, be made betwixt divine and human things, and betwixt the oracles of sense and faith, unless mankind had rather choose an heretical religion and a fictitious and romantic philosophy. The last particular in the fable is the games of the torch, instituted to Prometheus, which again relates to arts and sciences, as well as the invention of fire, for the commemoration and celebration whereof these games were held. And here we have an extremely prudent admonition, directing us to expect the perfection of the sciences from succession, and not from the swiftness and abilities of any single person. For he who is fleetest and strongest in the course may perhaps be less fit to keep his torch alight, since there is danger of its going out from too rapid as well as from too slow a motion. But this kind of contest with the torch seems to have been long dropped and neglected, the sciences appearing to have flourished principally in their first authors, as Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and C, whilst their successors have done very little or scarce made any attempts. But it were highly to be wished that these games might be renewed, to the honor of Prometheus or human nature, and that they might excite contest, emulation, and laudable endeavors, and the design meet with such success as not to hang tottering, tremulous, and hazarded upon the torch of any single person. Mankind, therefore, should be admonished to rouse themselves, and try and exert their own strength and chance, and not place all their dependence upon a few men, whose abilities and capacities, perhaps, are not greater than their own. These are the particulars which appear to us shadowed out by this trite and vulgar fable, though without denying that there may be contained in it several intimations that have a surprising correspondence with the Christian mysteries. In particular, the voyage of Hercules, made in a pitcher, to release Prometheus, bears an allusion to the word of God, coming in the frail vessel of the flesh to redeem mankind. But we indulge ourselves no such liberties as these, for fear of using strange fire at the altar of the Lord. Roman 27, Icarus and Scylla and Charybdis, or the middle way. Explained of mediocrity in natural and moral philosophy. Mediocrity, or the holding a middle course, has been highly extolled in morality, but little in matters of science, though no less useful and proper here, whilst in politics it is held suspected and ought to be employed with judgment. The ancients described mediocrity in manners by the course prescribed to Icarus, and in matters of the understanding by the steering betwixt Scylla and Charybdis, on account of the great difficulty and danger in passing those straits. Icarus, being to fly across the sea, was ordered by his father neither to soar too high nor fly too low, for, as his wings were fastened together with wax, there was danger of its melting by the sun's heat in too high a flight, and of its becoming less tenacious by the moisture if he kept too near the vapor of the sea. But he, with a juvenile confidence, soared aloft and fell down headlong. Explanation. The fable is vulgar and easily interpreted, for the path of virtue lies straight between excess on the one side and defect on the other. And no wonder that excess should prove the bane of Icarus, exulting in juvenile strength and vigor. For excess is the natural vice of youth, as defect is that of old age. And if a man must perish by either, Icarus chose the better of the two, for all defects are justly esteemed more depraved than excesses. There is some magnanimity in excess that, like a bird, claims kindred with the heavens, but defect is a reptile that basely crawls upon the earth. It was excellently said by Heraclitus, "A dry light makes the best soul, for if the soul contracts moisture from the earth, it perfectly degenerates and sinks. On the other hand, moderation must be observed to prevent this fine light from burning by its too great subtility and dryness." But these observations are common. In matters of the understanding, it requires great skill and a particular felicity to steer clear of Scylla and Charybdis. If the ship strikes upon Scylla, it is dashed in pieces against the rocks. If upon Charybdis, it is swallowed outright. This allegory is pregnant with matter. But we shall only observe the force of it lies here, that a mean be observed in every doctrine and science, and in the rules and axioms thereof, between the rocks of distinctions and the whirlpools of universalities. For these two are the bane and shipwreck of fine geniuses and arts. Roman 28, Sphinx or Science. Explained of the sciences. They relate that Sphinx was a monster, variously formed, having the face and voice of a virgin, the wings of a bird, and the talons of a griffin. She resided on the top of a mountain, near the city Thebes, and also beset the highways. Her manner was to lie in ambush and seize the travelers, and having them in her power, to propose to them certain dark and perplexed riddles, which it was thought she received from the Muses, and if her wretched captives could not solve and interpret these riddles, she, with great cruelty, fell upon them, in their hesitation and confusion, and tore them to pieces. This plague having reigned a long time, the Thebans at length offered their kingdom to the man who could interpret her riddles, there being no other way to subdue her. Oedipus, a penetrating and prudent man, though lame in his feet, excited by so great a reward, accepted the condition, and with a good assurance of mind, cheerfully presented himself before the monster, who directly asked him what creature that was which, being born 4-footed, afterwards became 2-footed, then 3-footed, and lastly 4-footed again. Oedipus, with presence of mind, replied it was man, who, upon his first birth and infant state, crawled upon all fours in endeavoring to walk, but not long after went upright upon his 2 natural feet. Again, in old age walked 3-footed, with a stick, and at last, growing decrepit, lay 4-footed confined to his bed. And having by this exact solution obtained the victory, he slew the monster, and laying the carcass upon an ass, led her away in triumph. And upon this he was, according to the agreement, made king of Thebes. Explanation. This is an elegant, instructive fable, and seems invented to represent science, especially as joined with practice. For science may, without absurdity, be called a monster, being strangely gazed at and admired by the ignorant and unskillful. Her figure and form is various, by reason of the vast variety of subjects that science considers. Her voice and countenance are represented female, by reason of her gay appearance and volubility of speech. Wings are added, because the sciences and their inventions run and fly about in a moment, for knowledge, like light communicated from one torch to another, is presently caught and copiously diffused. Sharp and hooked talons are elegantly attributed to her, because the axioms and arguments of science enter the mind, lay hold of it, fix it down, and keep it from moving or slipping away. This the sacred philosopher observed when he said, "The words of the wise are like goads or nails driven far in." Again, all science seems placed on high, as it were on the tops of mountains that are hard to climb. For science is justly imagined a sublime and lofty thing, looking down upon ignorance from an eminence, and at the same time taking an extensive view on all sides, as is usual on the tops of mountains. Science is said to beset the highways, because through all the journey and peregrination of human life, there is matter and occasion offered of contemplation. Sphinx is said to propose various difficult questions and riddles to men, which she received from the Muses. And these questions, so long as they remain with the Muses, may very well be unaccompanied with severity. For while there is no other end of contemplation and inquiry but that of knowledge alone, the understanding is not oppressed, or driven to straits and difficulties, but expatiates and ranges at large, and even receives a degree of pleasure from doubt and variety. But after the Muses have given over their riddles to Sphinx, that is, to practice, which urges and impels to action, choice, and determination, then it is that they become torturing, severe, and trying, and unless solved and interpreted, strangely perplex and harass the human mind, rend it every way, and perfectly tear it to pieces. All the riddles of Sphinx, therefore, have two conditions annexed, viz., dilacération to those who do not solve them, and empire to those that do. For he who understands the thing proposed obtains his end, and every artificer rules over his work. Sphinx has no more than two kinds of riddles, one relating to the nature of things, the other to the nature of man. And correspondent to these, the prizes of the solution are two kinds of empire, the empire over nature and the empire over man. For the true and ultimate end of natural philosophy is dominion over natural things, natural bodies, remedies, machines, and numberless other particulars. Though the schools, contented with what spontaneously offers, and swollen with their own discourses, neglect, and in a manner despise, both things and works. But the riddle proposed to Oedipus, the solution whereof acquired him the Theban kingdom, regarded the nature of man. For he who has thoroughly looked into and examined human nature may in a manner command his own fortune, and seems born to acquire dominion and rule. Accordingly, Virgil properly makes the arts of government to be the arts of the Romans. It was, therefore, extremely apposite in Augustus Caesar to use the image of Sphinx in his signet, whether this happened by accident or by design. For he of all men was deeply versed in politics, and through the course of his life very happily solved abundance of new riddles with regard to the nature of man. And unless he had done this with great dexterity and ready address, he would frequently have been involved in imminent danger, if not destruction. It is with the utmost elegance added in the fable that when Sphinx was conquered, her carcass was laid upon an ass. For there is nothing so subtile and abstruse, but after being once made plain, intelligible, and common, it may be received by the slowest capacity. We must not omit that Sphinx was conquered by a lame man and impotent in his feet. For men usually make too much haste to the solution of Sphinx's riddles, whence it happens that she prevailing, their minds are rather racked and torn by disputes than invested with command by works and effects. Roman 29, Proserpine or spirit. Explained of the spirit included in natural bodies. They tell us, Pluto having, upon that memorable division of empire among the gods, received the infernal regions for his share, despaired of winning any one of the goddesses in marriage by an obsequious courtship, and therefore through necessity resolved upon a rape. Having watched his opportunity, he suddenly seized upon Proserpine, a most beautiful virgin, the daughter of Ceres, as she was gathering narcissus flowers in the meads of Sicily, and hurrying her to his chariot, carried her with him to the subterranean regions, where she was treated with the highest reverence and styled the Lady of Dis. But Ceres, missing her only daughter, whom she extremely loved, grew pensive and anxious beyond measure, and taking a lighted torch in her hand, wandered the world over in quest of her daughter. But all to no purpose, till, suspecting she might be carried to the infernal regions, she, with great lamentation and abundance of tears, importuned Jupiter to restore her. And with much ado prevailed so far as to recover and bring her away, if she had tasted nothing there. This proved a hard condition upon the mother, for Proserpine was found to have eaten 3 kernels of a pomegranate. Ceres, however, desisted not, but fell to her entreaties and lamentations afresh, insomuch that at last it was indulged her that Proserpine should divide the year betwixt her husband and her mother, and live 6 months with the one and as many with the other. After this, Theseus and Perithous, with uncommon audacity, attempted to force Proserpine away from Pluto's bed, but happening to grow tired in their journey, and resting themselves upon a stone in the realms below, they could never rise from it again, but remain sitting there forever. Proserpine, therefore, still continued queen of the lower regions, in honor of whom there was also added this grand privilege, that though it had never been permitted anyone to return after having once descended thither, a particular exception was made, that he who brought a golden bough as a present to Proserpine might on that condition descend and return. This was an only bough that grew in a large dark grove, not from a tree of its own, but like the mistletoe from another, and when plucked away, a fresh one always shot out in its stead. Explanation. This fable seems to regard natural philosophy and searches deep into that rich and fruitful virtue and supply in subterraneous bodies, from whence all the things upon the earth's surface spring, and into which they again relapse and return. By Proserpine, the ancients denoted that ethereal spirit shut up and detained within the earth, here represented by Pluto, the spirit being separated from the superior globe, according to the expression of the poet. This spirit is conceived as ravished or snatched up by the earth, because it can in no way be detained when it has time and opportunity to fly off, but is only wrought together and fixed by sudden intermixture and comminution, in the same manner as if one should endeavor to mix air with water, which cannot otherwise be done than by a quick and rapid agitation, that joins them together in froth, whilst the air is thus caught up by the water. And it is elegantly added, that Proserpine was ravished whilst she gathered narcissus flowers, which have their name from numbness or stupefaction. For the spirit we speak of is in the fittest disposition to be embraced by terrestrial matter when it begins to coagulate or grow torpid, as it were. It is an honor justly attributed to Proserpine, and not to any other wife of the gods, that of being the lady or mistress of her husband, because this spirit performs all its operations in the subterranean regions, whilst Pluto, or the earth, remains stupid, or as it were ignorant of them. The ether, or the efficacy of the heavenly bodies, denoted by Ceres, endeavors with infinite diligence to force out this spirit, and restore it to its pristine state. And by the torch in the hand of Ceres, or the ether, is doubtless meant the sun, which disperses light over the whole globe of the earth, and if the thing were possible, must have the greatest share in recovering Proserpine, or reinstating the subterranean spirit. Yet Proserpine still continues and dwells below, after the manner excellently described in the condition betwixt Jupiter and Ceres. For first, it is certain that there are two ways of detaining the spirit in solid and terrestrial matter, the one by condensation or obstruction, which is mere violence and imprisonment, the other by administering a proper aliment, which is spontaneous and free. For after the included spirit begins to feed and nourish itself, it is not in a hurry to fly off, but remains as it were fixed in its own earth. And this is the moral of Proserpine, tasting the pomegranate, and were it not for this, she must long ago have been carried up by Ceres, who with her torch wandered the world over, and so the earth have been left without its spirit. For though the spirit in metals and minerals may perhaps be, after a particular manner, wrought in by the solidity of the mass, yet the spirit of vegetables and animals has open passages to escape at, unless it be willingly detained, in the way of sipping and tasting them. The second article of agreement, that of Proserpine's remaining 6 months with her mother and 6 with her husband, is an elegant description of the division of the year. For the spirit diffused through the earth lives above ground in the vegetable world during the summer months, but in the winter returns underground again. The attempt of Theseus and Perithous to bring Proserpine away denotes that the more subtle spirits, which descend in many bodies to the earth, may frequently be unable to drink in, unite with themselves, and carry off the subterraneous spirit, but on the contrary be coagulated by it, and rise no more, so as to increase the inhabitants and add to the dominion of Proserpine. The alchemists will be apt to fall in with our interpretation of the golden bough, whether we will or no, because they promise golden mountains and the restoration of natural bodies from their stone, as from the gates of Pluto. But we are well assured that their theory had no just foundation, and suspect they have no very encouraging or practical proofs of its soundness. Leaving, therefore, their conceits to themselves, we shall freely declare our own sentiments upon this last part of the fable. We are certain, from numerous figures and expressions of the ancients, that they judged the conservation, and in some degree the renovation, of natural bodies to be no desperate or impossible thing, but rather abstruse and out of the common road than wholly impracticable. And this seems to be their opinion in the present case, as they have placed this bough among an infinite number of shrubs, in a spacious and thick wood. They supposed it of gold, because gold is the emblem of duration. They feigned it adventitious, not native, because such an effect is to be expected from art, and not from any medicine or any simple or mere natural way of working. XXX, Medes or council. Explained of princes and their council. The ancient poets relate that Jupiter took Medes to wife, whose name plainly denotes counsel, and that he, perceiving she was pregnant by him, would by no means wait the time of her delivery, but directly devoured her. Whence himself also became pregnant, and was delivered in a wonderful manner, for he from his head or brain brought forth Pallas armed. Explanation. This fable, which in its literal sense appears monstrously absurd, seems to contain a state secret, and shows with what art kings usually carry themselves towards their council, in order to preserve their own authority and majesty not only inviolate, but so as to have it magnified and heightened among the people. For kings commonly link themselves, as it were, in a nuptial bond to their council, and deliberate and communicate with them, after a prudent and laudable custom, upon matters of the greatest importance, at the same time justly conceiving this no diminution of their majesty. But when the matter once ripens to a decree or order, which is a kind of birth, the king then suffers the council to go on no further, lest the act should seem to depend upon their pleasure. Now, therefore, the king usually assumes to himself whatever was wrought, elaborated, or formed, as it were, in the womb of the council, unless it be a matter of an invidious nature, which he is sure to put from him, so that the decree and the execution shall seem to flow from himself. And as this decree or execution proceeds with prudence and power, so as to imply necessity, it is elegantly wrapped up under the figure of Pallas armed. Nor are kings content to have this seem the effect of their own authority, free will, and uncontrollable choice, unless they also take the whole honor to themselves, and make the people imagine that all good and wholesome decrees proceed entirely from their own head, that is, their own sole prudence and judgment. Roman 31, the sirens or pleasures. Explained of men's passion for pleasures. Introduction. The fable of the sirens is, in a vulgar sense, justly enough explained of the pernicious incentives to pleasure. But the ancient mythology seems to us like a vintage ill-pressed and trod, for though something has been drawn from it, yet all the more excellent parts remain behind in the grapes that are untouched. Fable. The sirens are said to be the daughters of Achelous and Terpsichore, one of the Muses. In their early days they had wings, but lost them upon being conquered by the Muses, with whom they rashly contended. And with the feathers of these wings, the Muses made themselves crowns, so that from this time the Muses wore wings on their heads, except only the mother to the sirens. These sirens resided in certain pleasant islands, and when, from their watchtower, they saw any ship approaching, they first detained the sailors by their music, then, enticing them to shore, destroyed them. Their singing was not of one and the same kind, but they adapted their tunes exactly to the nature of each person, in order to captivate and secure him. And so destructive had they been, that these islands of the sirens appeared, to a very great distance, white with the bones of their unburied captives. 2 different remedies were invented to protect persons against them, the one by Ulysses, the other by Orpheus. Ulysses commanded his associates to stop their ears close with wax, and he, determining to make the trial, and yet avoid the danger, ordered himself to be tied fast to a mast of the ship, giving strict charge not to be unbound, even though himself should entreat it. But Orpheus, without any binding at all, escaped the danger, by loudly chanting to his harp the praises of the gods, whereby he drowned the voices of the sirens. Explanation. This fable is of the moral kind, and appears no less elegant than easy to interpret. For pleasures proceed from plenty and affluence, attended with activity or exaltation of the mind. Anciently their first incentives were quick, and seized upon men as if they had been winged, but learning and philosophy afterwards prevailing, had at least the power to lay the mind under some restraint, and make it consider the issue of things, and thus deprived pleasures of their wings. This conquest redounded greatly to the honor and ornament of the Muses. For after it appeared, by the example of a few, that philosophy could introduce a contempt of pleasures, it immediately seemed to be a sublime thing that could raise and elevate the soul, fixed in a manner down to the earth, and thus render men's thoughts, which reside in the head, winged as it were, or sublime. Only the mother of the sirens was not thus plumed on the head, which doubtless denotes superficial learning, invented and used for delight and levity. An eminent example whereof we have in Petronius, who, after receiving sentence of death, still continued his gay frothy humor, and as Tacitus observes, used his learning to solace or divert himself, and instead of such discourses as give firmness and constancy of mind, read nothing but loose poems and verses. Such learning as this seems to pluck the crowns again from the muses' heads and restore them to the sirens. The sirens are said to inhabit certain islands, because pleasures generally seek retirement and often shun society. And for their songs, with the manifold artifice and destructiveness thereof, this is too obvious and common to need explanation. But that particular of the bones stretching like white cliffs along the shores, and appearing afar off, contains a more subtle allegory, and denotes that the examples of others, calamity and misfortunes, though ever so manifest and apparent, have yet but little force to deter the corrupt nature of man from pleasures. The allegory of the remedies against the sirens is not difficult, but very wise and noble. It proposes, in effect, 3 remedies as well against subtle as violent mischiefs, 2 drawn from philosophy and 1 from religion. The first means of escaping is to resist the earliest temptation in the beginning, and diligently avoid and cut off all occasions that may solicit or sway the mind. And this is well represented by shutting up the ears, a kind of remedy to be necessarily used with mean and vulgar minds, such as the retinue of Ulysses. But nobler spirits may converse, even in the midst of pleasures, if the mind be well guarded with constancy and resolution. And thus some delight to make a severe trial of their own virtue, and thoroughly acquaint themselves with the folly and madness of pleasures, without complying or being wholly given up to them. Which is what Solomon professes of himself when he closes the account of all the numerous pleasures he gave a loose to, with this expression: "But wisdom still continued with me." Such heroes in virtue may, therefore, remain unmoved by the greatest incentives to pleasure, and stop themselves on the very precipice of danger. If, according to the example of Ulysses, they turn a deaf ear to pernicious counsel, and the flatteries of their friends and companions, which have the greatest power to shake and unsettle the mind. But the most excellent remedy in every temptation is that of Orpheus, who, by loudly chanting and resounding the praises of the gods, confounded the voices, and kept himself from hearing the music of the sirens. For divine contemplations exceed the pleasures of sense, not only in power but also in sweetness. Footnotes: